In this lecture, I intend to introduce you to narrative biblical theology. By way of introduction, we need to make some clarifications, some distinctions between ways in which narrative has been used in theological studies. And then we can move on to some examples of specifically a narrative biblical theology. So first of all, I'd like to make a comment about narrative theology per se. Narrative theology is something that we can trace to the 1970s. And in 1981, George Stroop was able to look back on about 10 years of narrative theology in practice and make some comments about where it's been and where it might go. About 10 years later, Gregory Jones and Stanley Hauerwas collected essays into a book called Why Narrative? And in that book, they asked the question, is narrative theology really a school of thought itself, and what's happened to it? And so around about the 1990s, we begin to get the answer to that question, that narrative is actually a category that was taken up into different theological movements, methods, and approaches, such that it did not become a school of thought per se, like capital L liberal theology or neo-orthodox theology. Now, narrative theology itself can dip back into the Orthodox theology movement earlier in the 20th century with names like Karl Barth, as well as H. Richard Niebuhr. And sometimes one of Niebuhr's little essays, called The Story of My Life, is the beginning of a discussion of what narrative theology is. But really, as a movement, it picks up in the 1970s and develops in different ways. George Stroop says, to offer a full description of human being must come to terms with the narrative structure of human identity. And we could just go over a whole host of names, philosophical, in hermeneutics, in theology, and other fields that explore the concept that human identity is structured and understood and interpreted through narrative categories. So, for example, you don't talk about the center of your life, you talk about the story of your life. And you don't talk about the center or the central concept, let's say, of your marriage, which is a relationship, but you talk about the character and the life together that you've lived. And those are narrative categories. So narrative then became a way of challenging the way in which synthesis was done. And obviously theology is all about synthesis. How do we synthesize our thoughts? How do we synthesize our behaviors in ethics? And narrative offered an alternative to the way in which that had been done in the modern era, which was more of a logical, more of an idea, more of a system approach to doing theology. Stroop says, if narrative is the necessary form for the articulation of personal identity, then it is not unreasonable to expect that narrative might play a major role in the theological interpretation and construction of the doctrine of revelation. And then he goes on to say, and if the doctrine of revelation is to be structured that way, so also all other doctrines. Now on this slide we have an example of a systematic approach to doing theology, a systematic structuring. We have different doctrines that a systematic theology will identify and discuss, but we also have a center that synthesizes these doctrines together into a system. And the question then becomes, what is at the center of a particular theological system. Narrative, as I said, though, is a different way of synthesizing theology. Instead of abstract theological doctrines that are related to one another logically, instead of a central doctrine that unlocks the meaning of the whole system, we have a narrative theology. One may ask what the center of Calvinist theology is, and give the answer that the center is the sovereignty of God. Or one may describe Lutheran theology in terms of the center of justification by faith. But again, narratives do not have centers. They have plots that reach a climax. A narrative theology may be explored by telling someone's story, for example. The theologian James McClendon, for example, did theology by writing biographies of persons' lives. And Stanley Hauerwas developed a narrative ethic that moved away from understanding ethics as application of some principle to quandary ethics. The question to ask is whether or not a systematic approach so rearranges the theology of the Bible that it actually distorts it, and whether a systematic approach is actually doing the same thing that a biblical theology approach does in rearranging material. Many times people would suggest that a biblical theology is closer to the text, and therefore it doesn't distort the Bible's teaching as much as a system might. I frankly would agree with that point, but here we have an alternative way of thinking from Gerhardus Voss. He says both systematic and biblical theology equally make the truth deposited in the Bible undergo a transformation. But the difference arises from the fact that the principle by which the transformation is effected differs in each case. In biblical theology, this principle is one of historical. In systematic theology, it is one of logical construction. And so, remembering the previous slide, we can conclude this quote with this. Biblical theology draws a line of development. Systematic theology draws a circle. And so that circle then describes the center, and all of the spokes coming out of the center are related to one another because of the center in the logical construction of systematic theology. So here then is the question of the difference between systematic and biblical theology. Pressing that slightly farther, we then can say, and when biblical theology is done, we are also engaged in a narrative theological approach. As Voss says, the principle of construction is historical for biblical theology, and so therefore it is a narrative that we're working with. Now, granted, historical reconstruction is, as Voss says, some kind of construction, not just a description. Yet, if we are not trying to get behind the text at some kind of historical construction, but are focusing more on the narrative per se in Scripture, then biblical theology almost necessarily has to be more of a biblical approach, a less distortive approach, than a behind-the-text biblical theology or a systematic theology using logical construction. Also in the 1970s, a new approach to biblical criticism began to develop, and sometimes called literary criticism more generally, or more specifically, narrative criticism. This movement took into account how to read a particular genre, stories. And think about it, the Old Testament and New Testament have a lot of stories in them, and entire books are stories. Some stories are historical, and so we have as one kind of narrative, historical narrative. Other stories can simply be made-up stories. We could talk about a parable as a very small made-up story. We can also talk about biography in this category as well. And so the question was raised, what if we stop looking at the Bible always in terms of the historical grammatical background and start reading these stories as stories? And so from the literature department we get some help to understand what that means. One of the names that's been significant in discussing a narrative criticism and literary criticism is Mark Powell. One of his shorter descriptions of narrative criticism can be found in a helpful book called Hearing the New Testament, edited by Joel Green. And in this article, Mark Powell lists various categories that help us understand what narrative criticism is all about. First of all, we create a profile of the implied author. Someone can write a story as if they're a different kind of person from what they actually are. So as you read the story, what kind of an understanding of the values, beliefs, and perceptions of the author or the implied author are you getting? Related to that, we have the implied readers. An author can write for a certain group of people, not necessarily the group that's reading the work, but for a certain group. Does a New Testament author write for Jews, for Gentiles, for Christians, for non-Christians, for a mixed audience, and so forth? Does the author write at a time of persecution or not? In other words, what can we learn about the implied readers as we read through the story? Thirdly, interpretation of narrative will look at issues like sequence of events, what happens when. And in that regard, we might say, how does Mark construct his gospel, and how does Matthew rearrange it and have a different structure? We could look at duration and frequency of events. For example, think about how much time is spent narrating the passion and crucifixion of Jesus over against the rest of Jesus' life and ministry in the Gospels. There's a different duration. Frequency of events, we could talk about how many times is there conflict with the Pharisees, for example, or causal links between events. Is it the temple cleansing that then leads to Jesus' crucifixion? Well, that seems to be the case in the Synoptic Gospels. In the Gospel of Mark, it is the event of raising Lazarus from the dead that leads to Jesus' crucifixion. Many stories can be looked at in terms of the unfolding of conflict, and this is one of the key ways in which plot is developed. So, for example, in Hallmark movies, two people meet, there's some kind of conflict that takes place, whether it's they don't like each other or some issues are keeping them apart, and the rest of the movie is all about how they overcome that conflict, get married, and live happily ever after. And although everybody knows the plot of those Hallmark movies, many people watch them endlessly because they're simply interested in the story as an overcoming of the conflict in the story. Now, related to that, there's the idea of readers or people watching those movies passing judgment as that plot unfolds. Also, there are in stories characters and characterization. How are the disciples characterized? And then there's also readers' empathy for the characters. You might fall in love with a bungling character in the story, or you might come to hate a person. And sometimes storytellers will even get you to hate a character whose ethics you actually agree with by the way in which the story is told. There's the question of point of view, the narrator's point of view, and then various characters' point of view. Mark tells you his point of view in Mark 1:1, that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. And various characters in the story express their understanding of who Jesus is. The demon-possessed people, the Pharisees, the disciples. There's plot development in terms of the point of view of the disciples as to who Jesus is. There's also spatial, temporal, and social setting of events in storytelling. Does it make a difference that Peter confesses who Jesus is in Mark chapter 8 in Caesarea Philippi? What does that spatial setting imply? Or I should say in the region of Caesarea Philippi in Mark 8. Then there is the question of symbolism. What does the temple symbolize? What does washing of hands symbolize? And so forth in the story. Often people point out how much irony there is in John's gospel. Jesus is lifted up on the cross, and he's lifted up in being glorified when he dies on the cross. There's great irony in that lifting up in John's gospel. Intertextuality has to do with what books an author is aware of and interacting with in the telling of the story. And in New Testament studies, we're interested in what Old Testament texts underlie the telling of a particular story. Jesus does things similar to Elijah and Elisha. Jesus can be compared to the character of Moses and so forth. And then there's looking for structural patterns in the telling of the story. And these kinds of categories then have to do with what narrative criticism itself is. Another way of applying narrative to theological studies is to look at biblical narrative theology. And for this, we can also go back to the 1970s. Hans Frey is a key name in this discussion, and we go back to a very important book in 1974 called The Eclipse of Biblical Narrative, a study in 18th and 19th century hermeneutics. That's the modernist age of biblical studies, when the historical critical method comes to dominate in biblical studies. Hans Frey laid down a narrative hermeneutic that challenged the historical critical method used in biblical scholarship. The real history of the biblical narratives in which the historian is interested is not what is narrated or the fruit of its narrative shape. Rather, it is that to which the story refers, or the conditions that substitute for such a reference. Think about, for example, the study of the historical Jesus. Is it that we're trying to describe the narrative of Jesus' life in Matthew's Gospel, or are we trying to use the Gospels and other sources, if possible, to reconstruct a history behind the text? The second is what the historical critical method was after, and this is what he is challenging. He goes on and says, in short, this historian is interested not in the text as such, but in some reconstructive context to which the text really refers and which renders it intelligible. Thus, the narrative is read in order to reconstruct that which it refers, to which it refers. Some historical event, rather than the reality that the narrative itself presents. And in this way, historical critical biblical scholarship has eclipsed the biblical narrative itself. So argued Hans Frey. There's no method per se for narrative biblical theology, but I might highlight 3 steps that are related to one another. It's not as if you choose one or the other, but rather these seem to be more like steps in how you might approach doing biblical theology from a narrative perspective. First of all, we could look at the theology within a biblical narrative, and in this case, our task would be fairly descriptive. what theology emerges as we look at a narrative of Jesus' life in Luke's Gospel, for example. There you're limiting yourself to a particular author, and you are limiting yourself to a particular story, and you are fairly descriptive, but not just of the narrative. You are trying to draw out what theology the author is trying to emphasize in the telling of the story. Secondly, we could look at the theology of biblical narratives taken together. That is, you're reading one story in light of another story, and therefore this is more of a synthetic task. James D.G. Dunn, in his book, The Theology of Paul the Apostle, finds 5 narrative ingredients to Paul's theology, for example. He says, we could readily speak of the substructure of Paul's theology as the story of God in creation, with the story of Israel superimposed upon it. On top of that, again, we have the story of Jesus, and then Paul's own story, with the initial intertwining of these last 2 stories as the decisive turning point in Paul's life and theology. Finally, there are the complex interactions of Paul's own story with the stories of those who had believed before him and those who came to form the churches founded by them. Now we can put this into the next slide and repeat these stories. So in this kind of a construction, we have the major biblical stories being God and creation, Israel, and then you could have aspects of that story like Chris Wright points out in his book, The Mission of God, where the 2 primary parts of the story of Israel are the Exodus and the return from exile. And then the story of Jesus as told by different authors. Paul, his story told both in Acts by Luke and then also gleaned from Paul's letters. And then the story of the church that emerges throughout the New Testament writings, but especially is told in the book of Acts. Now, these are major biblical stories, and we have not focused on, for example, the story of Abraham, the story of David, and we could look at very particular stories, my point is, in the Old Testament. The story of Elijah and Elisha as they relate to one another in the Old Testament and together as they relate to the story of Jesus. And so this kind of an intertextual reading of the biblical narratives is a synthetic approach to biblical theology done from a narrative perspective. So one of our questions then is, what are the stories that we should be looking at? How are the stories used in the Bible, and what is the relationship between these stories? Now, over against this kind of an approach, in 1984, notice the date, there was a fire shot across the bow at the whole narrative biblical theology movement. J. Christian Becker was a well-known Pauline theologian, and in his book, Paul the Apostle, The Triumph of God in Life and Thought, he said, Paul is not a storyteller. He is a man of the proposition, the argument, and the dialogue, not a man of the parable or story. Now, to some extent, by that point, he would have been responding to Richard Hayes' work. Now, Richard Hayes' dissertation was completed, I think, in 1981, and the publication of it in Scholars Press came out in 1983. So somewhere in the early 80s, people are becoming aware of Richard Hayes' work. One of the embarrassing things about my own dissertation work in the 1980s was that I didn't realize how relevant Hayes' work was for what I was trying to accomplish in my own work. and therefore did not use Hayes. But Hayes' book, The Faith of Jesus Christ, is subtitled An Investigation of the Narrative Substructure of Galatians 3:1 through 4:11. It sounded to me so particular that I didn't use it in my dissertation, but what he was actually arguing was that Paul's theology in general has a narrative structure to it. So when we read, as Becker would have said, propositions, arguments, and dialogue in the letters, notice the genre letters of Paul, we nevertheless are working with some kind of narrative substructure. And what Hayes was focusing on was a Christological narrative, a theological story of Christ, what I called, separately from all that work in Hayes, the gospel. So in my title of my dissertation, there are two narratives that are highlighted. One is the narrative of the gospel, which is the theological story of Jesus, not the story of his earthly life, but rather his, in expanded form, his incarnation, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, and his coming again. And possibly even you could add to that at the beginning, his preexistence. Now that large theological story is in large part what the gospel itself is. The other story that I highlighted was the mission of Paul and the church. And in a sense, you've got two stories right there in the mission. So the mission is the lived out gospel. It's the way in which Paul lives out the gospel story. It's the way in which he urges his churches to live out the gospel story. And therefore, it was a study in Paul's ethics. So much for my argument, which did not get published and is not part of the presentation that people give when they talk about the history of narrative biblical theology. I never attempted to publish it, and it soon became outdated as other people came along and wrote on narrative theology. N.T. Wright came out in 1991 with a collection of essays called The Climax of the Covenant, Christ and the Law and Paul in Theology, and then the beginning of his major work on biblical history and theology in the book New Testament and the People of God, which has had other books in that series published since then that have emphasized a narrative approach to biblical theology. Ben Witherington helpfully pulls together a lot of this kind of thinking and contributes to it in 1994 in his book, Paul's Narrative Thought World. And then in the early 2000s, a group of British scholars came together to study the question of narrative in Paul, and this was published in the book Narrative Dynamics in Paul, A Critical Assessment, edited by Bruce Longnecker. And this book has people who are for a narrative approach to Paul's theology and people who are against it. And so it's a helpful assessment in the early 2000s. All of this is still breaking ground on a narrative approach in biblical theology in this time period. And then, of course, there are people like Becker who push back and say this is not the way to interpret Paul. Longnecker says, in his description of what's been taking place in Pauline theology from a narrative perspective, he says, Hayes set the issue of narrative in Paul on the agenda. For Hayes, a narrative substructure is not behind the text, detachable from it, but rather beneath the text, undergirding it, supporting it, animating it, and giving it coherence, while also constraining its discursive options. Richard Hayes' book, The Faith of Jesus Christ, then looks not at stories in the Bible and stories as they relate to one another, and it does not look at the genre of narrative, but rather is actually looking at Paul's letters and claiming that there is a narrative substructure of the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to Paul's theology. He translates famously the phrase pistis to Christu as the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, as opposed to so many translations that take it as the believer's faith in Jesus Christ. And so one of the arguments in the last few decades has been whether we should interpret pistis to Christu as really a kind of narrative of Jesus, the faithful Israelite, who has accomplished what Israel failed to accomplish in its story. And because of the faithfulness of Jesus Christ, we who participate in the Christ story can experience what Jesus has accomplished for us. And so that is a very narrative kind of an approach. And to some extent, a new perspective on Paul approach. Although I think if we try to explore that too far, we get into too many difficulties of trying to describe exactly what the new perspective of Paul is and whether this is an essential part of it or perhaps a related issue going on about the same time. Now, N.T. Wright's second book in his series after the New Testament and the People of God was Jesus and the Victory of God. And it was also published in the early 1990s. In it, he looks for the basic story of the Old Testament. Israel's story, he says, was told in various Jewish texts in different ways. And the point to note is that Judaism did think of itself in narrative terms, and it did so in both positive and negative ways. So, for example, Psalm 105 is a positive telling of the story of Jesus, whereas Psalm 106, immediately following it, is a telling of the story of Israel from a negative and somewhat ambiguous perspective. And Wright goes on to list other ways in which the story of Jesus is told. Of course, famously, it's told by Josephus. In one of the articles in Bruce Longnecker's Narrative Dynamics in Paul was written by Edward Adams. And Adams says that Paul's narrative theology at least includes the stories of Adam, Abraham, Israel, and Jesus. And so he intends then to take one of those stories, the story of Adam, and explore how Paul uses that narrative in the book of Romans. Not throughout all of Paul's letters, but specifically in the book of Romans. So he sees several passages in Romans 1 through 8 as having an Adam narrative substructure to them. Adam and the human fallenness, Adam's rebellion and Christ's reversal, Adam's sin and God's command, Adam's sin and enslavement of creation, and the divine image and glory realized. Edward Adams says that in several passages in Romans, we have a series of events in consequential relation. The creation of human beings in God's image and with God's glory, to have dominion over the rest of creation, and ultimately to possess eternal life. The command to Adam not to eat of the tree of knowledge, Adam's transgression, and the fall from the divine glory. The entrance of sin and death into the human race, the subjection of the non-human creation to futility and decay, the ongoing failure of each of Adam's descendants to reach the divine glory, the Christ event and its reversal of the effects of Adam's sin, and God's activity in the lives of redeemed humanity, culminating in the eschaton with the realization of the divine image and glory, full possession of eternal life, and proper dominion over the created order. In this way, we have the story of Adam running throughout the theological points Paul's making, but only explicitly mentioned in Romans 5:12 and following. Adam's use of A.J. Grimat's narrative structure is part of his argument. And so he looks at how the story of Adam relates to the story of Christ and believers. Now, this presentation is not that difficult to follow, but it takes some time. And so what I would suggest is leaving that description to Robin Routledge's presentation of that in his Old Testament theology. Just note here that stories have three sequences: an initial sequence that sets up the story, the topical sequence where there are attempts to fulfill the story, and then or the object of the story, and then the final sequence that wraps it all up. Now, Adam's use of Grimat here probably is not quite accurate, and that's one of the issues with a lot of attempts to use Grimat. And most people using it in biblical studies say, look, we're not really interested in this as a theory. We're interested in talking about narratives using these categories. So look at the initial sequence first of all. It has 6 parts to it. And I'm going to label those parts according to the way Grimat does it. So for God, Grimat would call this the sender in the story, the one who sets up some objective. And then there's a subject of the story, in this case Adam, who is supposed to do something which might be presented as a person or as a thing. That's what appears above Adam here, and that is the image and glory here. That's what's called by Grimat the object. So the sender tells a subject to take an object and give it to a recipient. In this case, humanity would be the recipient. So there are 2 categories left in the initial sequence to label. And Grimat would say that sin and death would be the opposition, and then God's command is the help. So you have opposition and help in a story. And so we move then from an initial sequence in which Adam fails to offer the image of God and glory and declare the glory of God to humanity. And so then you move on in the story. And according to Adam's, the way that things move on are that Christ accomplishes what Adam did not accomplish. And so he overcomes the opposition of sin and death. He is obedient, that's listed as the help, and provides then through grace and righteousness to all humanity what God had intended in the first case. And then he has a final sequence where then he brings in another really story, the story of believers, in which what was set up for Adam to accomplish is now accomplished by the believers in Christ. So that's how Adams presents this or uses Grimat's approach. In the climax of the covenant, N.T. Wright argues that a number of biblical and later Jewish texts identify Adam not only with all humanity, but also with Israel as Adam's true heir. And so with this, I simply want to illustrate the point that stories can relate to one another. Just as we saw with Edward Adams, here now we see that the story of Adam, the story of Israel, and the story of humanity can be related together as well. And what Wright's point is that this is not just a Christian hermeneutic, but it is a Jewish hermeneutic at the time of the New Testament writers. So Israel then can represent true humanity. And this interpretation already begins in Genesis, where when Abraham is introduced in chapter 12, he is fulfilling the role originally assigned to Adam. And the story continues in prophetic literature with the depiction of a restored Israel from captivity as the new creation. And any story about new creation obviously relates to the original creation story. Also, there are occasional identifications of the king with the people in the Old Testament. And that opens up the possibility of a messianic figure representing true Israel, which in turn represents true humanity. And according to N.T. Wright, then, this is the very step that Paul took in his Adam Christology. Jesus, as the last Adam, represents those in him, who in turn represent the true humanity of the new creation. And that story is a story that builds on the story of Israel and its relationship to true humanity. Now, in what follows, I want to address the question of what is going on in Romans 7 through 25. It's made up of two paragraphs, which commentators will break either in between verses 12 and 13 or 13 and 14. And in those two paragraphs, we have Paul's description of the I who is struggling with sin and struggling to obey God's good law. And the cry, "Who will deliver me?" And so the question then is, what's going on here? What is going on? Now, there are so many different interpretations of this. And what I want to do is simply leave on the next slides different interpretations without talking through them, and take you to the last slide, which is going to be an interpretation that takes a narrative approach. Now, what you're very familiar with, no doubt, is the interpretation of this passage that takes this as a description of the believer's life. The believer continues to struggle with sin in this life until one day in the future we will be done with sin, but not presently. And so this is taken as a description of every believer's struggle to live a righteous life. That is how Luther took the passage. That's how Calvin took the passage. That is the most common way of interpreting this passage, which I would argue is not at all what Paul intends. But I'll leave it to you to look at the next few slides to determine what different options are out there. And then again, we'll stop and look at the last slide, presenting a narrative approach. Without going into the points, right in the middle in the left column, I say note the 6 arguments in Doug Moo's commentary presenting this very common position represented here. And so we won't go into that here. But now with this, then, we come to a position that takes a narrative approach. The ego, or I, in this passage refers to the non-Christian Jew trying to live under the law as seen from a Christian perspective. It's not a struggle that a Jew recognizes in living under the law, but from a Christian perspective, looking back, one sees the struggle to live under the law. The new perspective on Paul urges that Judaism was not a legalistic religion and had a secure place for grace and forgiveness. Hence the tendency today to emphasize from a Christian perspective. This seems also to be corroborated by Paul's own testimony in Philippians 3:6, that as to the law, he was perfect. Thus, Paul would not have said both Philippians 3:6 of himself and Romans 7:7 through 25 about his struggling with the law. And not only autobiographically, but also Jews in general experiencing as Jews a life of struggling to live righteous lives according to the law. Now there are two interpretations that are narrative interpretations for this passage, and it's possible that they're both right. The first interpretation would take an Adam approach, that the story of Adam underlies what's being said. And the second approach would say that Israel underlies this passage. The alternative would be then that both Adam and Israel, as narratives related to one another, underlie this particular passage. Now, as to the Adam interpretation, verses 12 and 13 are taken to apply directly to Adam. Paul uses... A final example comes from Herman Ritterboss. Note the date of his book, Paul, An Outline of His Theology, 1975. This is before a narrative approach comes into vogue in New Testament studies and in biblical theology. Ritterboss was often accused of taking too systematic an approach in his outline of Paul's theology. But here he shows that the idea of flesh, the term flesh in Paul, relates to the story, the narrative of Adam. The term flesh is often translated in the NIV as sinful nature, and that's quite unhelpful in my view. And here we can see why. The flesh is related to both the idea of Adam as the created being of God, that anthropological meaning, and a more theological, ethical meaning of flesh as sinful humanity. So as far as anthropology goes, we have the idea that flesh can signify humanity as God's creation. That's a neutral term. Or as humanity that is weak apart from God. And in that sense, it is slightly negative, but not sinful. Creatures need God. But on the ethical side, we move to a negative use of the word flesh in terms of sin. And here, too, we can have a reflection on the story of Adam. No longer just the creation of Adam and Eve, but now the sin. A sinful choice led to the sinful state of the world. And so flesh, in that sense, reflects the story of Adam. So I've chosen to illustrate a narrative biblical theological approach with Romans 7 through 25. The reason for doing so was that as you can see from the slides, there have been numerous interpretations through the centuries as to how to understand this passage in Paul. And I think for various reasons we can rule out some of these interpretations as simply implausible. And yet there still is the question, how do we interpret this passage? A narrative approach seems to offer a real possibility. But whether or not you're convinced of that, the point is a narrative approach does make a difference. And so in interpreting Romans 7:7 through 25 not as Paul's own experience or as the life of the believer in the present time, but as what it's like to try to live under the law, as illustrated either by Adam or Israel, then we are not going to use this kind of a passage to say, and Christians just continue sinning as ever before. Or the only difference between a non-Christian and a Christian is that Christians are forgiven, or Christians repent, or some such thing. But rather, we're going to see that what Paul's really dealing with in this passage is life under the law, whether it's the law that was given to Adam in the garden or the law that was given to Israel on Mount Sinai. And what Paul goes on to say is that we're not under law, but rather the righteous requirements of the law have been fully met in us because of Jesus Christ. So it's Jesus Christ who has met the demands of the law, not us. And we in him now dwell in the power of the Holy Spirit to walk in step with the Spirit. That's chapter 8. So Paul has a very different understanding of the Christian life from that theology that interprets Romans 7:7 and following as the life of the believer. Again, a narrative approach to the interpretation of the text leads to a very different theological understanding, but also a structural understanding of what's going on in Romans 6, 7, and 8 will lead, I believe, to the same conclusion. So with that, then, we have introduced a way in which to approach the biblical text and biblical theology from a narrative perspective.